Hello, my name is Becca Endicott, and today I'm going to be talking with you about the country Costa Rica, specifically the realm of persons with disabilities in this country, and kind of how they're treated and the services they've offered. And so with that being said, I'm going to give you a kind of a little coy into the information that I'll be giving you today. So I will be covering the background, societal perceptions, environmental, cultural considerations, education of children with disabilities, medical services, mental health services, housing, employment services, rehab technology, kind of the quality of life they have there, rehab-related agencies and professionals, and also the strengths and challenges that people with persons with disabilities deal with in Costa Rica. So with that being said, I'm going to start off by kind of easing into it. So many people across the globe tend to take the life they have for granted. So things like access to public transportation, equal opportunities, medical services, fine motor skills, the ability to walk, are just some of the things that people have access to but don't think about it if they don't think about if they didn't have access to it. I mean, going through this class, I was definitely guilty of that, thinking if I woke up with a disability the next day, I honestly don't know what I would do sometimes. So it's definitely neat to get an idea of what it's like in other countries and kind of the services they have to kind of make up for that. So granted, in some countries, many advancements have been made, but there's still a long way to go. So specifically for Costa Rica, there's been many milestones regarding persons with disabilities and the services that they have accessible to them there. But as I said before, there's still a long way to go with it. So that being said, I'm going to start out going through the history of Costa Rica. So specifically about persons with disabilities, not just the history in general. But so in the country, disability is more prevalent in men aging from 31 to 65, with 30% of disabilities in general there being motor related, and 28% being cognitive, and 11% being social or an emotional disability. So those statistics show that persons with disabilities make up a good chunk of the population in Costa Rica. So the total population of Costa Rica, however, is about 4 million people. So in some of the research I found, it stated that 400,000 of those people that live in Costa Rica are persons with disabilities, and they claim to feel excluded. So this was an issue that was addressed actually on June 1st, 2001, when they decided to kind of put together a little protest because they do have a law in place. It's called Act 7600, Equal Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities. Through this act, it was supposed to give persons with disabilities better opportunities and really kind of advocate for the basic rights that they should already be able to access, but that wasn't the case. So that's why actually Act 766 or 7600 was actually put in place in 1996, and then in 2001, when 2001 came around, they kind of were like, okay, this isn't really working out, like it's not how it should be, and so they kind of they advocated for themselves, and by doing so, it kind of got the ball rolling. So in Costa Rica, there's been many things that have changed, and I'll get into that in kind of the meat of my paper that have been good, but there's also still a lot of things that they need to work on, and a lot of barriers still for persons with disabilities there. So a lot of it has to do with they don't have the funding sources there. So due to lacking financially, they can't even provide the things that they should be providing, that this act should be enforcing for people who live in Costa Rica. So that's one of the main, the biggest issues. So moving on from the history of that, it is important to know how society views persons as a disability, because if people aren't advocating, or if they're not really like for persons with disabilities having basic rights, then you can expect that change is not going to happen. It's just not going to, because people have to be aware and people have to be on board. So I think that's one of the most important things is for Costa Rica, is that because they have so many people that reported feeling excluded, I feel like a lot of people in the society don't realize the importance of persons with disabilities having access to these basic rights. And so I think education in that realm is important, and I think it needs to be implemented more for people in that society to change their perception on having a more inclusive society rather than discluding a person because they have a disability. So one of the areas that can be, forgot to go back to a point. The government actually, in some of my research, I found that the government actually, even though they have this law in place for equal opportunities for persons with disabilities, they aren't really the government doesn't really create circumstances for that to actually be successful. So one of those areas would be education. So in Costa Rica, 95,000 kids with disabilities attend school out of 937,154 kids total. So I mean, that's a pretty good chunk, but there could always be more. So and one of the problems that many can't attend school is because 18% of the education centers in Costa Rica are accessible for persons with disabilities. So that's a very small percentage. So that just goes to show that architectural barriers are also a thing. So it's not that kids aren't wanting to attend school, it's that they can't because they aren't able to have access to that. And another thing I found in my research is that even some of the school teachers that they have there display negative attitudes towards kids with disabilities. So that's also a thing that definitely should be changed, and it should, because having this is one of the things that they should change, because it's important for kids with disabilities to have opportunities to get an education and do the things that they would want to do. And I think the teachers really it might be a lack of education of persons with disabilities, and if that's the case, then there should be adequate training, and they should be more aware of the rights that they should have access to. So spiraling off of accessibility regarding education, Costa Rica lacks in reducing environmental barriers for persons with disabilities. So kind of like I touched on before, only 18% of the educational centers are accessible to people or to persons with disabilities. So that's a big problem, because if only 18% of these education centers are accessible, that means that those education centers are, say one kid lives in point A and the education center that he could access would be in point B, and he can't go there because he's not able to access it and he's not able to get comfortable in his educational environment. So he's being restricted because of something that's out of his control. It's something that's genetic, something that makes him who he is, that he can't control, and he's being restricted from gaining something that everybody should have access to, and that's an education. So, and again, another problem in Costa Rica is that they lack the funding, and everything's kind of slow moving there. So typically in the United States, it's kind of like fast paced. This has to happen now. It has to be implemented now. But in Costa Rica, it's kind of like they set deadlines and they don't meet them because really society and the government isn't really putting that importance on it. So it's kind of restricting these things from actually happening. So although they experience some architectural barriers due to the slow pace of the country, one good thing I found is that I've kind of researched the housing market And I actually found a vacation home that is completely wheelchair accessible, which is awesome because this building has accommodations all throughout it. And it was this was actually put into place in 2016. So this was just recently, so it kind of shows you the kind of like slow paced kind of tempo they have there. But it's completely accessible, and when I was also reading about it, they still have a few things to tweak in it, and that's because some of the parts that they need to make the to take those accessible measures, they actually have to get it from out of the country. They have to go to the United States to get those things to make it accessible. So that again just shows you that they necessarily don't even have the resource, that good of resources at least, to be able to do things like this. So that was another thing I looked at. And then also going off of that, employment of persons with disabilities is one area that's actually doing like quite decently well. In 2012, they adopted a plan that would accelerate the employment process of persons with disabilities. And since implementing that, 1,653 persons with disabilities received service training in 2014, and then 49 started their own business, and disability-sensitive employment was implemented and created 453 jobs for persons with disabilities. So this is a huge deal. So the fact that they implemented it and the fact that they created that many jobs and they're getting kind of the ball really rolling with that, that's the most important thing, is like getting it started. So I'm interested to see in how many more jobs they're able to create in the years to come, because I think it was they implemented the plan in 2012, and then it took them till 2014, and that's where I got those numbers from. But so 2 years kind of seems like a long stretch, especially for like living in a fast-paced environment like we do in the United States. But that's a huge deal for them, especially since things are kind of really slow over there, and it takes a while to kind of implement things and get people to kind of actually do it. So next I'm going to show you a video on YouTube that kind of is a segue into the mental health and medical services for people in Costa Rica. So I'll show you that. So when looking at this video, I found a video of a man, this guy kind of speaks of his experience in Costa Rica, and he kind of talks about how he was receiving treatment, and then he just really didn't, it just wasn't fulfilling for him. And then he said once he received psychiatric help, his life completely improved, or like took a 360. And to me, this seems like people in Costa, or they were looking at it from more of a medical standpoint, instead of realizing this guy is still a person. He also has other things to that need to be met in order for him to be for his well-being, and like completely. So health isn't just the absence of physical pain or disease. It encompasses so many things, and so it's important to not even just with persons with disabilities, but for other people to realize that health is more than just about being physically okay. So that kind of demonstrated a little bit of outlook that I found from Costa Rica.
El mundo que yo sueño es un mundo que esté libre de misticismos, libre de cosas que a la persona discapacitada dejen de separarla. Un mundo en donde todos podamos participar. Hace 31 años yo comencé a tener problemas con mi discapacidad. Con mi enfermedad, al médico lo único que le interesaba era que yo llegara cada 6 meses y él llenara las recetas, hasta que hice contacto con el hospital psiquiátrico, en donde yo tuve una rehabilitación completa. Yo necesitaba una solución, que mi familia necesitaba una solución, no limitar el trabajo.
And then also, I also found that for every 15 physicians, there were 1,000 patients. So this to me seems like maybe this guy's needs weren't being met because he was seeing a doctor that was on a time crunch or had many other patients. So he was like, okay, just do this and it'll be solved. But he wasn't really looking at the person as a whole. He was just looking at it from a medical standpoint. So I feel like that's another thing that needs to improve, is that they either need to get more physicians available, or they need to kind of have training that allows them to see the signs and allows them to realize when a person isn't emotionally okay, not just physically. So after talking about all the medical services and mental health services, that leads me to the quality of life in those living in Costa Rica. So in the past, they've really had to advocate for persons with disabilities and even themselves to kind of even get the ball rolling on that. So I think that the quality of life overall has improved tremendously just from the things that I've seen implemented, like the accessible vacation house. And also, when I was researching, I found different tourist sites in Costa Rica that have actually added in accessible wheelchair ramps and just other implications that really allow tourists who have a disability to be able to experience these things, but also the people that live there. So that's a huge thing. I can't imagine living in a country and like having all these cool things to do, but I wouldn't be able to do them because I would be a wheelchair user and they wouldn't have a ramp that I would be able to use, or they wouldn't have accommodations for me to be able to do these things. So that's awesome that they're implementing that stuff, and that really shows that they're realizing that these things are needed. So an area of services that could use improvement, as well as other areas, is rehabilitation technology. So in Costa Rica, they have like the basic equipment available for rehabilitation purposes, but assistive technology is definitely a place where they lack. Again, because of the funding, and also because I was reading an article about it, and they just really they just aren't educated on the importance of it. So I feel like, again, if they were educated on the importance of it and really how assistive technology is used, I feel like they would allocate funds for that, or they would start to advocate for funding for that once they realize the importance of it. So I feel like that's another area that they could improve on. As for rehabilitation agencies, I found a few organizations that help to promote the advocacy for persons with disabilities in Costa Rica, not only in Costa Rica, but internationally, or from like a global standpoint. And so obviously the one that we talked about in our class is the Committee on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Disabled People Organization, and the National Council on Rehabilitation and Special Education. So I feel like these three organizations really work kind of intertwiningly to really promote and kind of enforce countries to understand the importance of persons with disabilities and them having access to the basic rights and the basic things that they should have access to. So these organizations all kind of lobby for and really help advocate for persons with disabilities. So that's a really great thing. So when I researched Costa Rica, they were not one of the most well-developed countries, and that can be seen with kind of architectural and kind of the barriers that they still have till this day. They definitely have the foundation, they have the infrastructure to be able to create that environment for persons with disabilities, to be able to create an environment of success and really allow persons with disabilities to become good, or not good, but to become members of society in an inclusive society at that. So in conclusion, many countries around the world are realizing the importance of advocating for persons with disabilities. They are making the adequate decisions in order to make things fair and make life enjoyable for those with disabilities, but there is still a long way to go, like I mentioned a few times. So in conclusion, I feel like many countries around the world are realizing the importance of advocating for persons with disabilities, and they're really making adequate decisions in order to improve their life and improve, actually make their life more enjoyable. So in order to eliminate future discrepancies in regards to persons with disabilities, we must learn to inform, advocate, and implement for those within our countries and also within other countries. And I really feel like if we do this, that it'll make a huge difference, because when we all come together as a whole, it's easier than just one or two people doing it. So I really feel like if people are educated on persons with disabilities and they realize the importance of persons with disabilities having access to these basic rights globally, I feel like the impact would be just tremendous. And so I really feel like we're headed in the right direction, and there have been adequate decisions that have been made in order to get us to where we want to be, but there's still more decisions and more things that need to be done in order to be where we should with persons with disabilities. So that's all I have for this project, but thank you for listening.